We are good to go. So, once again, hello. My name is Cody DeArkland. I look after developer relations at LaunchDarkly. A couple qualifiers. How many people know what LaunchDarkly is in the audience who've ever touched it? You don't count, Michael. You work here. Awesome. So I'm really happy to see not many people who are still like learning what it is overall. How many people have ever used Flask before in Python? Friends. So funny story, and we're going to touch on this in a second. Flask is actually how I learned to code. It was the first thing I ever learned how to build with, and I learned when I had my first daughter. I was always the guy who, might as well jump forward because we're going to jump into the whole story thing. I was always the guy who would bug his developer friends to build him web pages for things, right? Especially when I worked in real customer land and I wasn't at a vendor, and I'd want to show something, I'd want to render something on a page, or I'd want to be able to build reports. I had my friend, his name's Stephen Carnes, and I would always ping him, and we'd find weird ways to get him to divert his attention to help build things for me. And I did this for many, many years until I decided, okay, it's time to actually go and learn this thing. And so I have there's a very soft spot in my heart for Python and Flask, because my entire job now is spent doing code things all day, every day. I'd say I spend 80% of my days in code in some way or another, whether it's helping a customer figure out a problem, whether it's building like an interesting way to show what we're doing, whether it's building out how we actually do these things and telling stories about how to build that way. I spend most of my time in there now, and all of that was only possible because of sitting down and learning how to write Python. So spend most of my time in JavaScript now, but I always go back to Python whenever I can. So if you want to talk to me outside of this conference, or you want to talk afterwards, we actually have spun up our LaunchDarkly community. That's a Discord server. I'm in there all the time. I'll be in there all week. So if you see something in here, it's interesting, and you want to chat, feel free to drop in there. You can scan that with your phone. Join up. I'm in there. Cody DeArkland in the list. Just drop me a message. I'd love to catch up with anyone who wants to talk code, talk LaunchDarkly, talk other things. I'm always game. So let's get into it. So I want to keep this as minimum slides as possible. There's some that we're going to do after I do a little demo, but I always like the idea of just starting off with showing how the thing works. So we're going to jump in and show a little bit of a demo of LaunchDarkly, and I'll talk through where the Python bits are in that, and really give you kind of an overview of how it actually works. Once we get in with that, we'll go in and we'll explore how it works. I'll go through and give a couple of examples, why it matters, why it's cool, why it's interesting. Get behind the covers a little bit. And if we have time, we'll jump in and we'll build a little bit. I always like to use the Star Wars API as a fun thing to build against. So we'll just show some of the ideas of using LaunchDarkly to control different aspects of communicating with that. Again, these are real basic examples. We're not going to get in here and build a massive storefront or anything like that today. But really what we're going to show is how you can use feature flags to control different aspects of your application. Right? And what feature flags are is something we'll get into as part of the presentation. So I'm going to jump into the demo now. This you can actually hit from your phone. There's an app we're going to use as part of the demo. So if you hit this on your phone, you'll actually watch the demo change as we go in and use these feature flags. So as we start toggling different things on and off, as I change them, as I do things like targeting, which I'll explain soon, you'll be able to watch that happen on your phone without having to do anything. It's kind of the whole point of the platform. So it's definitely worth hitting. It's an interesting thing. If the QR code's not working for you, it's just demo-10.launchdarklydemos.com, which we will see right here. So this is you'll see this at the booth this week. Michael, who's in the back working the booth with me this week, will be running this demo quite a bit. And it shows a couple of different things that are interesting. It's a real basic application, doesn't really do anything other than show off LaunchDarkly. QR code on the right is just the same thing I gave you a few moments ago. It's a front end that's running in React. So if you don't know React, it's a JavaScript framework. It's a front end framework for the most part. But the back end is running in Python. So I host the React app as front end, and we communicate with Python for Flask for any API calls. So there are some database calls that happen. There's some user management stuff that happens. But it's kind of a two-tier application, and then there's a database hanging out inside of AWS running that powers the information side of it. So at the most basic level, what is LaunchDarkly? This is the LaunchDarkly platform, right? So LaunchDarkly, in the simplest way, is a management platform for releasing and shipping features. There's a lot more to that than just what is a feature. Who's ever used a feature flag for anything before inside of your code, right? So LaunchDarkly does that, but it does it at big scale. And so as an example, I have this feature flag here called App UI. If I go and turn this on, this would be a good time for you to watch your phone. We go in, it looks that way. I go in and turn this on. The application changes in a minute. Oh, am I on the right one? I am. I didn't save. There we go, I had a little bit of lag there. Conference Wi-Fi, gotta love it. We can see the application changed, right? So now we have a login screen in the middle. And that's a really basic example of just turning on a feature that changes the way the application works in some way. But this wasn't actually a good approach, because what we did is we turned this on for everybody, right? And so most people, when they work with feature flags, they experience the same problem. You turn on a feature and it applies to everybody, and if you want to change that in some way, you have to write that logic into the application, or write, if-then statements, catch statements around parsing out those users and control it that way. But if you don't do that, you turn the feature on, it's available for 100% of your users. If something went wrong, say that UI didn't render right, there was a problem in it, and I wanted to turn that off, I could easily come back over. Conference Wi-Fi, go. And it's removed from everybody, which is useful, right? If something's broken, I don't have to reship the code. I don't have to sit there and wait for 30 minutes for the image to build and redeploy. I can turn it off very quickly, but it's still impacting everybody at the same time. So there's better ways to do this, and that's where LaunchDarkly shines. I always tell people, if all you're looking to do is turn everything on and off, there's a million easier ways to do that. But everything beyond that is when it gets really complex, when you want to start controlling users, when you want to change it on the fly, when you don't want to have to reship the application, when you don't want to write complex reloads that only reload a part of your application. All of that stuff's handled right out of the box with LaunchDarkly. So if I go in, we'll turn that new UI back on, we'll leave that in place. But we'll hit this background styling feature flag. And so that first one was something we call a Boolean feature flag. It's just a true or false. If it's on, the feature's on. If it's off, the feature's off. This one, on the other hand, is a string-based flag. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing configurations down to change the background based on different properties. So I have this now. I have a login screen in place. If I was to come in, I could add a rule to change the targeting around a bit. We have this idea of contexts inside of LaunchDarkly. You'll see this in the presentation side in a bit, but a context is basically your incoming connection to whatever system, whether it's a front end or a back end, like a front end like React or a back end like Flask. A context is the state of your request. And what we do is we create an identity for you off of that. So when I log in here, it'll grab my username, and I'll be able to do targeting off of that. I can do targeting off of whatever I want. Right, it's not always a user, because a lot of times somebody might come into your system and not have a user associated with them. They might just be somebody in California logging in, or somebody in Florida logging in, or somebody in Pacific time zone, or somebody hitting a US West server. Right, there's a lot of identity things that don't apply to a specific user and really just a property that they have. In this case, though, we're going to stick with the user one just because it's simple. So we'll come in here, we'll do user, and we'll do name is one of. Actually, what we'll do is we'll do key, because that's a little bit easier to play with. Do Cody. And we can choose which version of it I get. So if I go in and I save this now, and I log in as Cody, wait a moment. I'll show you in the code where this is the Python backend that I talked about. So here's all of the different routes. So in this case, I just did a login operation, so that calls from my front end into this Flask. Ignore my code, it's just basic. It's not very interesting, but we can see I pull in that session key, and I create a key off of it that becomes that user object. Now, whenever I'm doing anything else inside of the product or inside of the API, that identity exists as part of my LaunchDarkly context. I definitely made a mistake on that targeting rule, because that should have updated already. So we'll go back in. And what we'll do is we'll go up here and we'll do it as a target instead. There we go. There I am. So what I'm doing here is I'm changing the default rule, so it only shows that new version for my user, but everybody else gets a default. So the default one that's in there right now is just a standard grid background, but I've targeted only my user with that change. So now I'll turn this on, hit save. And that update. Normally it wouldn't flash like that. We're dealing with some bandwidth issues, but on all of your phones, when you're looking at this, you should not see those spots on the bottom. And again, really basic example, what we're showing here is the idea that I can change in very big ways the way an application works based on somebody coming in and a feature flag that I've configured. This was just a string path out to like a background file, but you can think about this in the context of where we're going to get to around how I might control what database someone's connecting to or what upstream API someone's connecting to. If I wanted US West users to hit a database in US West, being able to configure that dynamically, but then also be able to change that. And the real power of this isn't necessarily in just being able to dynamically change that, it's being able to change that without the redeploy. Because a lot of times it's only a few lines of code to redo this, but that's also a change request. That's also, oops, I was told not to hit that, and I just did. That's a change request, that's a redeployment, that's waiting for it to roll out, that's testing the new deployment. There's all of these things that happen when you have to push out new code entirely into production. And when it's all controlled via feature flag, you have the flexibility to do that without that redeploy. So cruise forward now. We'll get into the interesting back-end stuff now. So that was all front-end feature flag so far. That was just changing different ways that the application itself shows things out to users. But then, again, the whole session's about back-end and being able to control the way APIs work and be able to roll out new API changes. So I have this debug menu here that only displays when we've configured it for a specific user. So there's no targeting in place right now, so you guys don't see that on your phones. But if I was to go in and say, I want to roll this out just to me. We already showed this, but I can go in and do that. Save it. Load. It'll load eventually. The lag is a little rough. That debug menu will ultimately show me what database I'm connected to. By default, with it off, the application's set up to connect locally. So if I go back into my code here, I have a route that's set up specifically for database connections. So this is the one that returns back data. And you can see inside of here, I'm setting up the LaunchDarkly client. So I'm going out and setting up against the SDK key that's configured specifically for this project. So this marries directly into this configuration. So if I go in here and I was to pull down this server-side key, that is that connection. And what that does is it connects the SDK that lives inside of that backend with LaunchDarkly and creates a persistent connection back in to receive those feature flag updates. I pull in that user information from the login, right? So I'm doing just a default of debug user when things aren't working right. Otherwise, I'm using this user key. And I'm setting that user inside of the application itself. So I'm applying this to LaunchDarkly and saying, hey, this is the user who's come in. So in the real applications I use, I typically pass this as like a server-side cookie and bring it in, or I'll do like a JOT authentication and decode the JOT as part of this. For here, it's just simple to have it be a user. But then once we have that in place, we can start to look at the values of feature flags and make decisions based on them. So this is a feature flag that's called dbinfo inside of LaunchDarkly. And if I pop back out and we go look at that one, in this one, I'm using a JSON-based flag to just push down basic configuration data. I removed out, the demo I usually do has the additional connection. Basically, it writes out the entire connection string. I didn't want to broadcast that out to everybody as part of this demo. So really, it's just a shortened string, but you can parse anything out of that and run that connection string through just the same way I am here. So if you look back in the code now, we can see I'm pulling a mode out. If it's local, use this local dummy data. Otherwise, go out to DynamoDB, and start pulling in information from there. Again, a very basic example, but when you think about how this applies in real world environments, words are hard, it gets really interesting because you can, like I said, you can start to configure US West users are getting a new database, but only for users who are physically in US West at 2 a.m. You can run that until 6 a.m. and then have it switch back. All of that's able to be automated inside of the platform and able to roll out. And so we have this concept of testing in production, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek phrase that scares a lot of people, but the idea being we can never completely remove risk, and that's why we test so much. That's why we're so careful about doing rollouts in production, because when things go wrong, that's usually a very bad thing. But when you can completely mitigate the risk out, when you have the ability to turn off that flag immediately, and it turns off within a second, and then you can also limit it down by targeting and control who's actually receiving that change, you start reducing that risk down to a point where it doesn't, while it's still there, it's still a risk, it's not as scary of a risk because the rollback is half a second to make everything go away. Or you take the different approach and you start off with the rollout disabled, you ship it disabled, no one sees it, there's no change, but you target somebody on your developer team and say, hey, I want to test this out with you first. Then you expand out to your QA users, then you expand out to your dev users, gradually growing that amount, that pool as you see fit. Then maybe you move into a percentage rollout and start doing that rollout as well. All that stuff is ground floor table stakes. There's not a lot of tricks to make that happen in the platform. That's just what the platform does. But you start having full control over the risk side of this. So if I go back in, I'm going to reset that feature flag again because this connection is killing me. Go ahead and just make the default that for now, and we'll just delete the rule. And we'll save. Come on. Yeah, we're having some brutal lag here, so it's not going to switch over. But if that did work, you would see it switch over, and it would grab the new data from that database instead. Let's see if the API side works. There we go. Let's go. Yeah, lag is just killing us, so we're not going to be able to see that this time. But if we did, we would see this change on the bottom, and it would show cloud instead. And when we clicked on this database field, it would show the filled out information from that database. And you can see it as I toggle that on and off, it'll immediately switch back and forth between those data sources and show that information out. So sorry the lag is killing us so bad on this one. So that's the overall demo, and you'll see this at the booth if you want to come by and talk to us, and we can go through the steps again. But I want to talk a little bit about how this all works behind the scenes now.
This is something that my channel works a lot with Quickly.
There we go. So again, we talked a lot about this at kind of great length, but the idea of Launch Darkly is it lets developers control what's being released to who on your timeline, right? It sounds like a very markety phrase, and maybe it kind of is, but it's also very true, right? You can target based on anything, right? We're not limiting down to users. You can target based on properties, target iPhone versus Android, you can target laptop versus desktop. Anything that you want to bring in, I've even seen examples where people start to tie that into their own identity platforms, and they start bringing in things like, I want to roll this change out to the 12th floor first, people in this section of the building or this office first. All that stuff is table stakes. And so you can control who and then when, whether you want to schedule it out, whether you want to do percentage based, you want to roll out 5% of the time. We had one user who came through and has such a large scale environment, they're shipping to millions of people. We had to make an adjustment to the platform to roll out to sub 1% at a time. So they're doing like 0.5% at a time over gradual periods of time to release features out. All that stuff is table stakes. So the idea being, if the feature's on, run the new code. If it's off, run the old code. We showed this in the apps. You can see it's funny because I actually grabbed this screenshot sitting back there just a few minutes ago. We talked about the back end side of it as well. So when we talk about front-end flags, we're often talking about like new components in the application, right? Maybe it's a new login screen, maybe it's an entirely new layout, maybe it's a new theme. It's really oftentimes about like visual things inside of the front end. And we're all about giving people, like in those scenarios, it's really giving people access to like that functionality and being able to see it. One of the companies I worked at previously used this to roll out changes into a cloud platform. So they would roll out visual changes to like their favorite customers and let them get validation and help them pick through, hey, is this, or have them help the vendor pick through, hey, is this structured right? Does it make sense? Does the user access pass? So kind of a cool use case. The fun one is when you have errors pop up and being able to just turn it off and the error just disappears from everybody at the same time. But that's a very common thing with front-end flags. But because back-end flags aren't as visual, they're not as oftentimes things people see, they're more things people interact with. Sure, you can sit there and you can call an API and see how it returns and then refresh it afterwards and see the update. But a lot of times it's more about platform connectivity and connecting to back-end services, whether it's other APIs, whether it's integrations, whether it's databases. A lot of times it's stitching the application together. And so like while the front end gets a lot of attention because it's pretty and nice and looks cool, the back end is oftentimes what powers the entire application in the first place. And if you lose that, the front end's not really worth much other than just being really pretty to look at. A couple of examples of things that I've seen people do specifically in the API space with LaunchDarkly. I've seen people do selective maintenance modes, right? They'll take down a part of their API for a maintenance for some reason, right? They want to pull it down, but they want it still accessible for the test team so they can keep testing it and test the changes out as they roll out. So being able to have it maintenance mode for everybody, but have a feature flag in place that says, hey, if you're in the dev team or you have this header present or this JOT token decrypts and has this value in it, go ahead and allow that person to access. Super common, again, table stakes stuff. I've seen people roll out like the V2 approach, you have API/V1, API/V2. Being able to roll that out via feature flag, again, super common. People will put user identity behind that and say only these users can access it, only people in this department can access it. So gradual rollouts of that. And the gradual thing is an important one. We talk about this idea of progressive delivery a lot. And progressive delivery is this idea of gradually rolling out a change instead of rolling it out to everybody, being able to do smaller groups at a time and increase that as you see fit or reduce. That's been kind of a theme of this conversation so far. But that's where the most mature people get to is doing those gradual rollouts and gradual rollbacks. Dynamic configurations. This one, I like this one a lot, but there's dragons in there. So you want to be obviously careful with that to a certain extent. You want to make sure your application has safe fallbacks because there's a time where the API or where the SDK has to connect to LaunchDarkly. And if you're nulling out all those values until that connection happens, the first experience of someone hitting that's they're not going to have any value. Man, that thing is in a bad place. Sorry about that. That's going to give them a bad experience. So you want to make sure that your safe default values are having it off or having something that lands for the users, maybe placeholder text, stuff like that. But other than that, once the application is initialized, being able to change those values on the fly and grant people access to change those, right? When I was doing development work previously, a lot of times I didn't want to be the one configuring that. I wanted to set up the system to be able to have someone consume that, but I expected somebody like ops to be doing that, or I expected a product manager to be doing that for their customers. And so when you can build this in and then turn that access over to them, that's a really powerful thing. It means they don't have to be the ones going into some config file and re-pushing it out themselves and pulling change requests on it or pulling PRs on the code. The other one is like exposing additional functionality. You might want your API by default to only expose a couple of specific properties and a couple of specific controls, but being able to expand that out and say, hey, if Cody comes in, he can do these more things, or if Tom comes in, he can do less things. All right, being able to control that and add or remove functionality based on user is another really common API pattern that happens in LaunchDarkly. The kill switch thing is probably the thing I think most people start with. It's the idea of, hey, I've turned on these features, they're out in the wild now, but something broke and I want to roll them back. So the idea is something happens inside there, throws a 502 or has a problem, you can very quickly turn that off via a couple of different ways. The first way is just the regular old toggle approach, right? Turning the feature off, and then it goes back to the stable existing code. We also have this idea of flag triggers. Flag triggers are basically a webhook that you can attach to a feature flag, and you can have systems call that. So we have integrations like stuff like Datadog or Dynatrace or other APM tools, Grafana, and all of these can actually fire off a call to a webhook based on specific values, right? So if you have a login page you've rolled out and it's throwing 100 errors a second, that's just broken. There's no real else to it. That thing is broken. So why have an administrator have to go in and turn that feature off? Why not just have one of those APM tools send a request in to disable that feature and roll it back to what it was before? So flag triggers are a way people do that. People also do that in something called workflows that I'll actually pop back in and show before we move on too far. So once that's disabled, and this is a nuance that I don't think people always get when they first look at this. This code is actually removed from execution. When it's off, it's not just hidden. It's not like a div that gets hidden behind something or something gets escaped out. It's completely removed from the execution of the code. So it just doesn't, it's not running anymore. And so those errors just disappear while that code is disabled. A lot of people think, oh, you're just hiding it some way. It's not really being hidden, it's just being legitimately disabled. It's not in the execution path anymore. It's not part of the execution runtime once it's disabled. So I showed this in the demo a little bit, but just a little bit more of a visual example. If the application is set up running normal, the new API is turned off, but then coming in, turning it on, application suddenly starts communicating with the new API. That API is communicating with one of the databases at a given time. It's probably connected to the bottom one by default. Yep. And then once we turn it on, we connect over. And all of those are simple feature flags. You can dramatically change the way the application communicates with just a few toggle clicks. Starting to unpack targeting a little bit. When we wrap targeting around these, you guys saw this in the UI, we can wrap these around different properties that apply to the user. So we can enable this only if the group is in the test, or the user's group is in a testing group, or if their location's in the West Coast, or if their device is a MacBook. Any of those properties are things that we can do. We just made a big change to the way contexts work, where originally we had everybody be a user object, and we would consider anything using LaunchDarkly as a user. But what happens when your users aren't people? When it's a refrigerator, for example, when it's a set-top box. We have a streaming customer who releases features to new set-top boxes as part of their gradual rollout. So they'll start off with the newest device. The newest device gets the newest functionality, and they'll gradually roll back to the V2 of the box, the V1 of the box. They don't even collect identity from those users who are logged in as part of this. They do all of those features based purely on the physical device that they have. So the way that context works, and we call that object a context object, if the user's group is dev testers, we turn the feature on, and they get the new thing. For everyone else, it's turned off. We've talked a lot about APIs in this one, and Python as a key example here, but these are all the SDKs we support. There's actually a couple more that haven't been added to this list yet. I think Rust is on there now. But these are all the different SDKs we support across a number of different front-end, back-end platforms. There's a few that are frameworks of JavaScript that are supported. For example, Svelte is supported, SolidJS is supported. All of those work because they're just offshoots of JavaScript effectively. But we've got a pretty wide range of support. I've been working a bunch recently in our Swift SDK. I've been working in the React Native SDK a bunch, doing a bunch of mobile development things. And the value of that is that all of these things happen consistently at the same time. So if you've got a front end running in React, and you've got your back end running in Python, and you've got users connecting from iOS devices or React Native devices, they're all going to receive those feature flag updates at the same time, just because of the way the system works. All of those updates are going to be processed at the same time on those devices. So you're not going to have this experience where it's customized per SDK. Well, there's language customizations, obviously, but the way those actually render on the device is consistent. And so this is what it looks like in Python itself. And an example that we'll throw together really quickly here in a moment, assuming the internet cooperates with us. We install the LaunchDarkly server SDK. So we have two different kinds of SDKs, client side and server side. They work a little bit different, but they still produce the same kind of consistent results. LaunchDarkly is a server side SDK. So we install server side SDK. We bring in the config module. We set the config with the SDK key. It's important to note this isn't an authentication mechanism. It's just a communication mechanism. There's different sets of keys for things like when you want to do secure mode and you want to lock down the SDK. Because nothing is being changed inside of the application, it's really just a read-only. So all it is reading feature flag values. There's no change there. So like several of my examples on my GitHub repo will have the SDK key exposed because it's not. For the server-side SDK, there's a little bit of a concern, but for like the client side, it doesn't matter. It's just reading data. We set the context. So we go in this case, I throw out a silly one of context key 1, 2, 3, and then I give that one a name. So we build out that context, and then we evaluate the feature. So in this case, we're evaluating a QR code feature. We're feeding it the context, and we're giving it a default value of false. So if something goes wrong, SDK can't communicate, application has something weird, and it's just not reaching out, it'll always get that safe default of false. But in other times, it'll read that back, and now that val object becomes the feature flag value, and that updates on the fly every time the code runs. So I said we go back and show a couple of other things inside of the UI before we cruise forward and before I go try to build a little bit with this and show something. So if we go in and we look at the database migration as an example. We can see the flag trigger in here. So we see flag triggers right here. These are all of the different integrations we support for flag triggers. So we can bring in through Datadog events, we can bring in through Dynatrace. Generic trigger we'll talk about in a moment. Honeycomb, New Relic, all of those will provide integration back into LaunchDarkly and feed their actual APM values in and be able to make actions or take actions against feature flags. The generic trigger one is a lot of fun because you can start to bring that into like CI/CD pipelines, right? So if you have like a REST call as part of the final task in like your pipeline, or if you want to inject a REST call into it, you can have the final task of your CI/CD flow be to enable the feature. Be careful with that because think about how a pipeline works. Every time that pipeline runs, it's going to enable that feature. So if you were trying to fix something in it, you were reconfiguring in some way, you didn't want it there, it's probably not good to have it turn on every single time. But you very much can use it in that way and have this be a part of a kind of a programmatic rollout. So generic triggers, I use those a lot. I'll do those inside of silly demos where I'll have like a React state and after 5 failures have it automatically disable the feature. Totally doable with flag triggers, and they become a core component of how you build like automated resiliency into a system. We use it for a lot of solutions where we want to have someone build out a way to have a system recover itself without APM integrations. So generic triggers are great for that. What you get out of that, so here we have the flag trigger. We'll save that. It gives us a URL. And we should actually be able to just call that, provided the internet cooperates with me. We'll delete this other one out. So we're just a real basic post against that with empty data. And if you remember, that was turned on originally. If I refresh this, it should be off. There we go. So those turn it off instantly. It's just a webhook inbound that deletes that turns off that feature when something goes wrong. Workflows are how you create a repeatable process around all these rollouts. So if you want to roll out a change and you want to build out a process around it that you can then save as a template and use later. We'll take a look at this progressive rollout one. We can choose which version we want to run out. So in this case, we only have the local database or cloud, but what if you had different regions, right? I talked about that before. You could have each region be a variation here, and you could roll that out over time. So in this case, I'll roll out the cloud database. I want to do it at 10%. We'll do 20% at a time every day. And what that'll do is it'll create out a workflow that will gradually increase that every day. So here's the first day. Every day at 12:03 p.m., roll out the next component. And you can see it's starting to cycle between each of those, 40 versus 60, 60 or 40, all the way to the end. We can also start to bring in things like approvals in here, right? So if I wanted to come in and say, change targeting groups, I could go into the very top and add an approval instead. We did scheduling in this case. That's why the approval is not available because we scheduled it out. Those are all things we can change. Again, we can save that as a template then, and it now exists to be reused across other ones. Or we can come in and build this from scratch and have full customization. So if I came in and said, Leon's workshop team could add a flag change. We can turn it on. We can request additional approvals for it from like the QA team. And again, we can gradually go through this and build out whatever we want it to be, change targeting rules, add them out, and continue to roll this change out over an entire group. The big thing here is that this becomes, again, a repeatable thing you can use over and over again on future rollouts and deployments. Now, before I roll into building a little bit live, I think it's probably a good time to ask, is there any questions? Anybody want more information on anything you saw? I'll repeat your question if I hear you.
Yeah, so my question is about like Kubernetes and using cluster type deployments. You talked a little bit about the pipeline. I'm curious if you have anything that's more like pod oriented where you can route instead of putting your changes down in the code itself, you can change the infrastructure of how the routes of the request go at the pod level instead of.
So it's funny you bring that up. So my very first presentation I ever did at LaunchDarkly was LaunchDarkly in a service mesh world. So that is usually what I'd use like a service mesh for. My background before I came to LaunchDarkly was in service mesh. So LaunchDarkly, it's important to note that it runs inside of your application. It runs within the application itself. So it's not necessarily aware of the infrastructure that lives above it. It's just your application itself. And so I think there's a side of this infrastructure story and how you want to roll out and point at a different service in Kubernetes. You want to obviously link up your pods to a service as an example, and being able to do like service-based routing with like a Consul or a Kuma or an Istio, whatever service mesh you want. They all do the same. They all have the same capability. They call it service splitting. And so the idea being for infrastructure changes, something like a service mesh is great. And being like Flux, I'm a huge fan of Flux. You can use Flux to gradually roll out a change. But like the struggle Kubernetes has is it can only go so far into the application itself. Like you can get HTTP codes back from it. You can check basic statuses and basic returns. There's a little more you can do with a fair amount of hackery, but it doesn't necessarily understand the inner workings of the application itself at a deep level. So the answer, unfortunately, is it's a both world scenario. When you want to control pod connectivity and which pod is live and what percentage is going to each, I usually defer to like a service mesh in that case. But when you want to control within the application and roll that out, it's more of like a LaunchDarkly concern. I think where this becomes like especially relevant is when you're doing larger pod deployments, like if you've got a significant amount of a significant size of like a replica set, and it takes a while for those all to cycle out. If you have LaunchDarkly disable the feature while like a service mesh is splitting traffic to the new pods, you can validate the new pods are receiving traffic. There's no errors with the things that you've deployed in there, and then deploy out the feature. You still end up in a situation where half of your people are on the old pods and half your people on the new pods getting the new feature, but you get the maximum kind of risk control then and protection against them. So hope that helped or just created more questions. Any other questions? Hit me.
You mentioned that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You guys have relay proxies or like a relay proxy option?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. I didn't even mention that. So for environments that are maybe have specific needs, I usually think of them as security risk or security concerns typically, but it's not always that. We offer this thing called the relay proxy, and let's see if I have the presentation handy. No, I don't. The way LaunchDarkly works at its core, the SDKs reach out to a set of CDNs that live globally. From there, those CDNs reach back to the LaunchDarkly core. The relay proxy lives between those CDNs and your SDK, and you configure your SDK to connect to that relay proxy, and that becomes really useful when your app's running on like AWS, and you want to keep flag evaluation really close to it in the relay proxy. So you can set that up right there, and then you can control ingress and egress through just that relay proxy instead of saying, hey, my users are going to connect to any of a dozen different URLs for flag information. You can connect it all to that relay proxy. So we absolutely have a relay proxy. Like I said, people usually do it for security, but there are also performance concerns too. I used the configuration management example earlier. If you're doing that heavily, relay proxy is a great idea to use. It scales out really well horizontally, so it's very small. It's basically like a Go binary that runs, and you can run it in a container or whatever. Throw a load balancer in front of it, and you can scale it horizontally pretty far. But yeah, the relay proxy is heavily used by a lot of customers. It's a good tool. Any other questions? Oh,
Can you like roll back something if you notice a lot of exceptions that's running in that code?
so yes, you'd obviously, you'd want something that sees those exceptions, like a Datadog, right? Or some sort of a monitoring tool that can see those.
Too many exceptions, does it like automatically?
Yes, yeah. So that's the whole flag trigger concept does exactly that. So if the demo I have that runs elsewhere is in Datadog, and what we do is I'll have like a load tester run up, and I'll spin it up against a specific route, and I have Datadog set up to fire an event when it's at 100 errors, and that fires the event that triggers this off. It's a direct integration. There's no like special code to do that. That's just you tie in Datadog. You say this is the flag that I want monitored, and then in Datadog, as an example, in Datadog you say fire an event at when this metric reaches this threshold, do this thing, and it turns it off. And that applies again to Honeycomb. I think they can do it in Grafana now. Grafana integration just rolled out. So yeah, absolutely, super common. We like systems that recover themselves. Any other questions? So the way the system is designed right now, so the question was, can you have multiple functions within a single feature flag? And if so, how was that? I think it was, how is that controlled? I might have missed the end of that question. But the way that the feature flags, the way the system is designed is each feature flag should really be one feature. But we have this idea of flag prerequisites. So you can have a flag prerequisite set that says, hey, this is dependent on this feature. This can only be enabled if this feature is turned on. And so what you do is you end up grouping those together and you say, hey, I have this parent feature. Like for example, I only want to roll out the new database if the new API is enabled, right? I've separated those out so I can have good control. I've componentized it out and say, I can develop my API separate from my database now. But the new database is only going to work if the new API works. So I'm only going to turn that on if the API is on. Same concept applies more broadly, right? I only want the new API and the new database to work if the new front end is on too. So you can start to chain prerequisites together, and that's how you end up grouping them together. We have this come up a lot. There's a lot of discussions internally around what to do about that, because like the idea of grouping flags together comes up quite a bit. Beyond that, we have this idea of different projects, right? So different groupings of feature flags. So an example of a project might be if you're an e-commerce store, you might have a project for the store component or a project for the user management side of it. That's one example. Or you would have it all lumped into one and break it apart into different environments. There's a lot of different ways those can be configured, but projects and environments is one way to do it. I personally really like prerequisites for that. It just gives me more control, and I get to have a central view of where it's all set up instead of having to click through and browse different areas. Thought I saw another hand come up over here. Back.
So when doing feature flags for release control and effect, one of the things I find that becomes problematic over time is you end up with a lot of old code and old flags. Are there any ways to like look at how long flags have been set, like one, and then B, is there any like static code analysis tools that I can run over and say, hey, all these feature flags, right, this code is dead, I can remove it?
Yeah, so we do have, there's a couple different answers to this. One, we have this idea of code references in the product. And code references ties into the Git repo for your code. And what this will do is it'll show everywhere in the code where that actual feature flag is in use. So in this case, login, and there. Right, so inside of this project, in app.js, that one's used. In login.js, it's used. And then I think the backend, the login's not used in the backend one. So that gives you visibility and it lets you see it, which is great and helpful and good. Lifecycle is something we're working on, and there's a public, it's not a secret thing. There's a public EAP going around, a new capability in the tool to start looking at flag health and lifecycle of the flag, and like how often are you using them? How often are they being called? How often are you removing them? So it collects all of that data. So the same thing you're asking for, it will basically be another module inside the product. There's in the short term, we have this insights area that'll let you see like how a flag is being evaluated and used. That'll give you data back on that. It's not just transparency. It's not as like forward as saying, hey, this flag has not been called. We will do that actually for flags that haven't been called or haven't had an evaluation in 30 days. You'll have a message above it that says, this flag's not being evaluated. You might want to get rid of it. But we've been making that a lot better. It's kind of the end state of that. But then code references are usually where people start with that. I like this also for like, it sounds like a funny use case, for team onboarding, because when you bring someone onto the team, they don't always know where this stuff is being used. So being able to tell them, hey, go into code references and you can see everywhere where we're using like this feature flag today, helps them get familiar with the code faster, helps them understand how things are actually being used. So I like that as well. Question?
Yeah, so you mentioned webhooks and things like that can be used to trigger feature flag changes. So is there an audit trail to see when the feature flag has changed or been changed?
Absolutely. So we have an audit log built into the product down yonder. So this is just like the end product version of it. We also have this thing that like it's a feature that for the longest time I was here I didn't think was actually used a lot, but it's actually used quite a bit. It's a data export. So we have the ability to have all that data get exported and like dumped into like a Snowflake or into the Amazon version. I'm blank. Kinesis. There we go. Drop in Kinesis for data analytics and things like that. So a lot of people will use that to send it out and kind of collate all this data together to be able to run it. But a fair amount of customers just use the audit log in the product also because you can see it all logged out in here. But you can see, as you can see, it gets pretty specific. Changes the default variation, changes the target use rules. And so this can also be controlled. We have an entire, like any system like this, we have an entire user policy section. So if we were in the same company and you were in security and you needed accesses, but you didn't want anybody else to see that, right? Like, it's a weird example, but we're gonna roll with it anyways. You could easily create a set of policies that says, hey, only this group can see the audit log, these ones cannot see it. Only these users, like product managers, can change targeting rules, but they can't enable or disable. We leave that with the ops team. Only the ops team can enable or disable the feature. Like, we can get really granular in that.
In terms of performance, I'm assuming that there's some kind of a cache layer in your API so that it's not, it doesn't have the potential to create blocks or things in the flow of your application.
This is a great, it's funny, I had a bunch of architecture slides in the deck, and then I pulled them out because I didn't think they were going to get used, and now I regret pulling those out because it sounds like they would have been the most useful. So we talk about the layers of resiliency in the product that protect against stuff like this. The one that applies to this situation is that when the SDK turns on, so when I turn the application on, whether it's I hit the website for a client-side code or I turn it on server-side in Python, Python main.py or whatever, the SDK does an initialization. So that initialization, it goes out to one of those CDNs I talked about earlier. We have over 100 of them globally. And it pulls down the first set of flags. It stores that flag information in memory locally. And what it does is it opens up a long-lived connection back to LaunchDarkly for updates only. So we minimize the performance impact because there is a cache, but it's local in memory. And so it's able to reference that extremely fast. We're talking like in the millisecond range to be able to do that. It only reevaluates when that changes inside of LaunchDarkly. So for example, in this one, when I went in and changed the targeting rule on this, any connected system would have gotten a broadcast of, hey, somebody changed this flag, update it in your in-memory store, and that rewrites it in memory. We do that via something called, well, it's server-side or server-sent events, but it's also, it's server-sent events, but it's also streaming. So we only send down the flag values that change. So we're not sending the entire bundle because like in a small demo like this where it's 5 flags, the performance is inconsequential. It doesn't matter. But when you have 100 flags, that's a lot to evaluate. We only send the ones that change. So in that example, if I had 100 of them, only this flag would be sent out to be updated in those in-memory stores. But because that's all cached locally in memory, the performance impact is really small. The area you get, you'll run into application stuff much faster. Like if you're re-rendering your application based on a feature flag, like if you're writing in JavaScript and you're using like hooks in React, and you want to change the entire layout of your page. Yeah, if you're changing 5 different layouts across 5 different flags and toggling them constantly, that app is going to just choke up, not because of launch darkly just because you're re-rendering the entire thing that many times. But for like API side of it, the performance is really small. We're talking in the sub 50 millisecond at that point. We benchmark updates at, we benchmark initialization at under 100 milliseconds. So you should have all of your flags available to use in under 100 milliseconds. And any change should be client rendered within 200 milliseconds. So either way, the speed at which those flags should update are well under half a second. Any other questions? You're all believers now. I can feel the energy in the room. So we only got about 10 minutes left, so I think because of the internet issues, we're going to skip out on the Build It Live phase. But if you do want to get into that, I'll be around the conference. Again, I'm on Twitter. You can drop me a message, Cody D'Arkland. I love interacting with people in the community. I love just teaching people about this stuff, like software development stuff. I spent so long in my career not knowing this and not having people who were willing to teach things like this. So I'd love to interact with anybody who wants to learn more. Jump onto our Discord server, scan that QR code, hang out, drop me a message, even just to say you liked the session, you enjoyed the session. But hey, I appreciate the time. I'll be around the conference. If you see me, I'm hard to miss, kind of tall. Come talk to me. Love to interact with people. But thanks for coming and hanging out. It was great.